All right, welcome to today's new content video. We're going to keep this at a rather minimum with the new requirements for the AP test. Many of you are going to be thrilled that we can actually do shorter videos and shorter new material, and even at that, be done with new material probably sometime into next week. I'm thinking about a 20-minute video here today, maybe 30 at most. We're going to talk about commercial agriculture. If you have not watched the subsistence agricultural videos and the agricultural revolutions from last week or the week before last, you actually need to just stop this video now, go back and watch those first, okay? You can watch this one later, tomorrow, something like that. Go back and watch those first, though. You need to try to do these in order as much as possible. Have any issues with the video? Let me know. Last week or the week before spring break, we talked about subsistence agriculture being a type of agriculture that is done to feed your family. It is done in small plots. It's done with a lot of hand labor. It's done mostly in less developed countries. That would be your stage 2s and stage 3s. And it's not as efficient as commercial agriculture. Like today in the United States, we're mainly commercial agriculture. We used to be subsistence. Subsistence requires a lot of farmers. Excuse me. And with that, commercial agriculture actually requires a lot of technology. So those are some of the big differences. I would make sure in my notes I could do a comparison and contrast of 15, well, maybe that's a little much, 10 or so things that are different about commercial and subsistence agriculture. Commercial farms are most popular in rich MDC, stage 4 and 5 countries. They're also often run by corporations. Big businesses often run commercial farms like Tyson Foods. They run these like factories to mass produce a product in a way to sell cheaper and to send and sell around the world in a global market. So commercial farming is what we're talking about today. We're going to cover mixed crop and livestock farming. We're going to cover dairy farming today. That's the only two we're going to cover today. We're going to keep it short. And you have got to know these really well, and you've got to be able to map where they are common in the world and very, very precisely where they are found in the United States on a map. So let's get started. Mixed crop and livestock farming. Where can you find those? Mixed crop and livestock farming is found around Ohio, North and South Dakota, parts of Wisconsin, well, a little bit of Wisconsin, but basically part of our Great Plains and what we call part of the Midwest. It's almost like a belt. Remember the Corn Belt? The Corn Belt is part of the mixed crop and livestock area. You saw that on maps early in the year. We called that a formal region because you could tell there was a lot of corn there. If you're in Iowa, if you've ever been through Iowa, you would say something like, I didn't know there was anything but corn in Iowa. Not many people there. But it's also popular in Europe and Russia to have this kind of farming. So what does this mean? You know there's corn there. You know there's some wheat and stuff like that. Mixed crop and livestock means the type of farming happening in this region, they grow crops, but they also have animals there, mixed. Why? Well, the reason they grow crops is because usually the land is very fertile. Corn and wheat and soybeans are the most common crops. But they grow these crops not mainly for human consumption in this type of agriculture. They're being grown for animal consumption. Pigs, cattle, even chickens sometimes, but mostly pigs and cattle. Because in a place like the United States, the reason they're growing a lot of corn in Iowa and Indiana and Kentucky is to feed those animals, because a lot of us like to eat hamburgers and we like to have our nice steaks and we like to have our sausage or our, whatever type of meat you like the best. So what these farmers, these big corporate farms, again, commercial farms are huge farms usually, hundreds or thousands of acres with lots of machinery being used. What they know is, for example, in America, we like meat. And because we like our meat, they're producing in that part of the country great soil for producing corn, soybeans, wheat. They produce that and they feed it to the animals and fatten the animals up in preparation for the animals to be slaughtered and sold to Americans or anybody else around the world. Because at the end of the day, I don't need to tell you what's more profitable, selling corn or selling steaks or hamburger meat or pork loin or whatever it may be. The businesses, it's economics 101 here. Businesses know they can make more money by selling meat. So let's fatten up the animals. That's their approach. And let's produce the food the animals need to fatten up. They're cutting their costs by doing that. And then let's make money by selling the animals. That's mixed crop and livestock farming. Now, there's some important terms that we want to talk about with mixed crop and livestock farming, and some important ideas that we need to talk about related to it. First of all, again, if you were to go over and look in Iowa and Kentucky and this land, what you're going to see is a lot of corn. You're not going to see, unless you really look hard, you're not going to see a lot of cattle. But they're there, trust me. They're not there in the way we might see cattle in East Tennessee. Cattle in East Tennessee are out in a pasture, grazing on the land. Not in this part of the country. This is an area, these farms where they house these animals are called feedlots. You need to know that term. Feedlots, feedlots. Feedlots are places where animals are getting prepped for slaughter. This is where they are not on grass. They are kept in a barn, in a huge livestock barn, or in some type of outdoor corral by the thousands, potentially, in close quarters, because they don't want them walking around, because they're preparing the pigs or the cows to be slaughtered and to be produced into meat. The more the cows and pigs walk around, they lose weight. So you don't want that. So they're going to make sure that they have plenty of weight, and they're going to feed them and fatten them up with the corn and stuff they're growing. So they're able to grow the corn on the land right near the cattle, so they don't have to transport it very far. Again, economics 101. And then they don't have to buy the feed. They just give it to the animals, fatten the animals. Some of them own their own slaughterhouses, slaughter the animals. Some of them own the package companies, and then they send it off to the people who are getting the retailers and stuff who are going to buy the product. And so they're selling the animal because the animal is worth the most money, but they're using the land to mostly produce the corn and the feed. So that corn you see in Iowa, we're not eating that mostly. That's mostly being eaten by our animals that then we're eating indirectly this stuff through them. So feedlots is one term you need to know. Another term that we used in last week's lessons or the week before last, intensive and extensive agriculture. In commercial farming, there's also the use of extensive and intensive. Intensive agriculture is where you're getting the most out of a smaller piece of land. Extensive, extensive, extensive agriculture is where you're using a lot of land, like nomadic herding and like slash and burn agriculture from last week. But here, the animals in the feedlot is more intensive because they are put close together in close quarters, and a lot of people don't like that. Again, environmentalists, people, health, people really concerned about health, they don't like these animals being put in close quarters because they don't like, they're given a lot of times antibiotics to keep them from getting sick because they're afraid it would spread real quickly. People are concerned about how that affects us then when we eat that. We'll have possible sicknesses that are grow mutated to the point the antibiotics don't do any good. You also have some animal mutilations, like chickens have their beaks cut off so they won't hurt each other. You have, all kinds of things. That cows' tails are sometimes cut off because they're in such close quarters. And so there are a lot of criticisms. That's something you need to know too. Some of the criticisms of these big commercial feedlots, but they're more intensive. The places the corn is being grown are more extensive. Now, what's all that mean? Corn requires more land than fattening cattle and pigs. So the farmers will use the land mostly to grow the crop. And then they don't need as much land to corral and fatten animals. So what is that useful? Because on FRQ, some of you are struggling with land use. This is an explanation of land use. You don't need a lot of land to fatten up the animals, but it's nice to have that place where you're corralling and fattening the animals near the cornfields, which requires more land. So extensive practices with the corn and wheat, and more intensive practices with the sheep or the cattle or pigs. Now, guys, this works the same way in cities. If you were describing housing, in cities, housing is more intensively built, whereas in suburbs, it's more extensive. Use those words. Please use those words. They're looking for those words. The suburbs are extensive because you like a big yard, you have a suburban home, extensive land use. But in the cities, we build things vertically to get more intensive use out of the land. Fattening the animals is more intensive, whereas the growing of the food for the animals is more extensive. Another criticism of this type of agriculture, look here at the bottom, is it's, people say, inefficient. Why don't we just eat the corn? Why don't we drink the water we give to the cows and the pigs? And wouldn't that make a better use of our resources? Well, by statistics, it would. But we're a consumer society in a rich country. And we're not the only ones. But how many of you like your hamburgers? How many of you like your steaks? Like your pork? Okay, I like mine. And so with that, we demand, consumer demand, capitalism. We want meat. We want grain-fed meat. And therefore, that's why they produce them. If you ever see a big cattle trailer on the road that's got like 2 or 3 stories, a semi-truck, and it's in East Tennessee, it's probably headed to this part of the country right here because they buy, those companies do, a lot of our animals in this area, and they take them out there and they fatten them up before slaughter. Because the more fat they get on them, the more meat they're going to get and more money they're going to make at the end of the day. So it's definitely geographic, extensive, intensive. Know the feedlots, intensive and extensive. Know the connection to the Corn Belt. Know that this is also popular in parts of Europe and France and also in Russia. It's also popular in some parts of South America, in a few places in South America as well. But feedlots are part of mixed crop and livestock farming. You think about our meat industry in the United States, which produces our food. There's about 5 companies in this country that produce most of our beef and our pork. And this is how they operate right here. Now, mention some negatives. Environmentalists also have concerns about feedlots. Imagine the waste products. I don't need to explain that in any more detail, I don't think. But imagine the waste products that are produced. And there's concerns about that, along with the antibiotics, along with steroids that these animals are often given to make them more muscular, and how that affects humans, and how that some of that stuff will affect the environment, the pesticides on the corn, stuff like that. So those are some criticisms you need to know about. On the positive side, though, commercial farming like this is one of the reasons we don't have bigger food issues in the world today. You know, during this whole coronavirus thing, I know you've heard about people running to the grocery stores and buying a bunch of stuff, but economists will tell you over and over, we don't have a food supply issue. There might be some hiccups in the chain of transportation of some things getting to the stores, but we got plenty of food because of types of farming like this. So people can criticize commercial farming, and there's plenty of things to criticize, but the bottom line is it allows us to mass produce food, and mixed crop and livestock farming is one example. I have some other pictures of this I want to show you in just a few minutes, but we'll go ahead and do the second type first. Before we do that, the other type we're going to talk about today is dairy farming, another type of commercial agriculture. This is found in the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. It's found around the Great Lakes. That's one way you can talk about it. Clustered, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, parts of western New York. And one reason, and you do need to map these, one reason these locations are significant is dairy cattle. There's different kinds of cattle, different breeds of cattle, but there are dairy cattle and there are beef cattle. In the last type, mixed crop and livestock, we were talking about beef cattle. They're the ones that get fattened up with the food, with the grain, and then basically we eat them in a restaurant or we buy them in the store and eat them and stuff like that. The dairy cattle are bred so that they will produce milk. We are not producing dairy cattle typically to eat the meat out of them. So with that, they require some different climates. Dairy cattle do not do well in hot climate zones. So they need cooler weather. They also get sick a lot easier. Their milk gets bad. And so the northeastern Great Lakes area, Britain, or not Australia, but New Zealand, those are areas where dairy cattle do really, really well because they are a little more susceptible to a lot of things. So you see a picture here kind of Holsteins. Holsteins are dairy cattle. They're designed to produce milk, not to be food sourced as far as, now we do eat them sometimes, but that's not what they're really designed for. So these are prominent in the northeastern U.S. Make sure you know this. and the area around the Great Lakes, states like Minnesota, Wisconsin. And there's a new one we need to add to this list that's not on here. We need to add Canada. I'm not sorry. Canada's on the list. We need to add California to the list. California is a new hotspot for dairy industry. So why is this so important, and why do dairy cattle geographically exist in these places? Well, climate's part of it, but we need to talk history for a minute. Locationally, butter and cheese obviously come from the dairy industry, and butter and cheese, you can produce them and let them, you actually need cheese to set for a while, for bacteria to grow in a certain way. But milk's a different story. So historically, very important you understand this, the geography of milk production changing in the world in the United States. This has been an FRQ a couple times. There was a concept known as the milk shed. Now, there's also a building known as the milk shed. That's not what we're talking about here. But this concept was a geographic concept. Because if you've ever tasted soured milk, you'll probably never want to taste it again. It's terrible. Usually you don't taste it because usually when you pick it up, you smell it before you taste it. It corrodes. It's awful. So milk spoils. We know that. If you've ever tasted it or smelled it, you know that. Milk spoils. So milk shed was this idea geographically that you had to have dairy cattle be close enough to the market, the citizens who wanted to buy the milk. They couldn't be far away because it would spoil. So there was a time, distance decay. There was a time mechanism here. So historically, because of spoilage, dairy farms would be located within 20 to 30 miles of major cities, because that's where most people are that were going to drink the milk. So if you look, very important to know this, in American history, if you wanted to find dairy farms, all you had to do was find America's big cities or any of our cities, and then drive about 20 to 30 miles away from that city in any direction, and you'd start seeing a lot of dairy farms. The rural communities in the areas around the cities, like the periphery, semi-periphery core kind of relationship, would produce the milk on the farm, and then milk trucks would come in every day, get the milk, process the milk, and then they would take it to the stores. Or back in the old days, you may have saw some old movies, they would actually hand deliver, milkmen would, milk to people's homes every day, because there was a timing mechanism. You could not let the milk spoil. So that was historically the geography of American dairy farms, was they were scattered across the country about 15 to 30 miles from major cities, or any cities for that matter. For example, Knoxville was a major market for dairy, and so Jefferson County had a ton of farms, dairy farms. So did Anderson County, so did Loudoun County. Hamlin County had a market, but also had dairy farms here. But a lot of those dairy farms don't exist anymore. Why? One is those old dairy farms were smaller operations, usually run by families. Today, commercial farming has took over, and we have new technology that means we don't have to have a dairy farm that milks cows 20 minutes away from the city. Why? Look, refrigerated trucks, refrigerated trailers, refrigerated whatever. Mechanisms that allow milk, it'll still spoil. Trust me, it still spoils. But it will last much longer. From the time it leaves the barn, the milk never leaves refrigeration. Stays in the truck refrigerated. If it has to go to a plant, processing plant, then to the store, it stays refrigerated. And so it will last a couple weeks, at least longer. So now, today, you don't have to have dairy farms be that close to cities. It's still nice if they are. And the other thing that's happened is American farms have become business-like. So the big commercial farms have bought out a lot of the small dairy farms because they can afford, and milking is expensive. A lot of machinery is needed. These big farms can buy lots of machines and then milk thousands of cattle a day using machines, whereas small farmers can't afford all the machines. So what's happened, maybe even to some of your grandparents, in the last 50 and 60 years, small dairy farms have sold out their herds, have sold out some of their equipment to the big farms. And here in places like Hamlin County, we see empty silos like this, old barns that are run down because they're not operating. I think there's maybe 2 or 3 dairy farms still operating in Hamlin County. There was like 20 years ago. So the bigger farms have took over. What does that mean geographically? Now we don't have dairy farms all over the country. Instead, we've got clustered, very important, dairy farms due to refrigerated trucks, technology, and a new economics of scale, meaning big business farming is dominating the dairy industry because they can afford to buy the stuff that the small farmer can't. Now, dairy farming is profitable, but it's costly. So big business is setting in a good shape. There are farms in Wisconsin and Minnesota today that milk 10,000 cows a day. But look at how they look differently. Look at the pictures of some of those farms. Just you can't see nothing but the barn for like hundreds and thousands of feet, and you see cows and more cows, and you see machines hooked to the cows to get the milk instead of people doing it by hand. Same thing in California. So we've clustered our dairy farming. It's become commercialized. It's basically become like it's a factory farm. That's what it's become. Now, criticism of that is that they're probably going to give those cattle different types of medicines to keep them from getting sick. There's going to be mass-produced milk. What if the milk is contaminated? By the way, that's a very scary thought. But if it gets contaminated on one of these commercial farms and nobody catches it, that's a problem for not just the people on the farm. That's a problem for whoever drinks that milk wherever they are in the world. Whereas back in the old days, if you had contaminated milk on one farm, the only people that was really going to be a problem for was the people drinking the milk from that farm. But with commercial farms today, that is an issue. Now, we have better technologies to help clean the milk, but it's still a problem. Also, these cows are in close quarters, more likely to get sick, that type of thing. A lot of criticism in recent years, too, about inhumane treatment of animals on some of these big commercial dairy farms. But you need to make sure you know that, again, on the positive side, they're mass producing milk at a very cheap price. And, of course, they're producing butter and cheese, although the geography is not quite as significant as far as where they have to be based on that. Now, I do want to show you a couple things, and I apologize for not having it pulled up quicker here. But if you look in the agricultural part of our OneNote, you will see each of these types of commercial farming pages, and you will see the PowerPoints that I'm showing you. You will also see a great diagram, show you what this looks like, of how mixed crop and livestock work. In other words, here comes the crops they're producing, and then they obviously need sun and water, and then they're going to feed this stuff to the animals, and then they're going to try to get it out to humans to the marketplace. So here's the input, here's the output, and then it takes into account some losses financially that are going to go into it. Here is some pictures. This is the area of mixed crop and livestock, predominantly in the United States, a USDA map, U.S. Department of Agriculture. There's also something on here about ethanol. You might have heard of ethanol at the gas pumps before. Ethanol is gasoline. Corn ethanol is gasoline that adds corn additives to it to cut down the price of gas. And that is used in now our gasoline in the United States. It was a way to help farmers, they thought, and reduce the reliance on fossil fuels. Recent years, this has become less popular because, and by the way, in Brazil, they use sugarcane instead of corn. But mechanics are now telling us that corn ethanol is not great for engines. It wears them out. It causes things to get dirty, basically not run very well. But as you can imagine, corn ethanol is most common in the same places where we have mixed crop and livestock because they're going to make the ethanol close to the corn. Just makes sense to make money. And so here's the ethanol plants in the United States. Where's the corn belt? It's right there. Ethanol plants are near the corn. Also, this is what a feedlot might look like in the United States. This is the first type of farming we talk, mixed crop and livestock. This is the type of lot. They don't want them running around. They're fattening them for slaughter. They don't want them eating grass. Americans like grain fed, or at least most of us do, and they know that, and that's how they're operating. Here's what a feedlot might look like as well. Here's the cattle eating out of a large trough, very close quarters to each other. And here, get this bigger, percentage of pig and hog and pig sales as a percentage of agricultural sales. Look at where most of our pigs and hogs are produced. Same mixed crop livestock area, with one exception over here. North Carolina is famous for hog farming, has been for years. And so that is another hotbed that you could be asked about potentially. Use these maps. Please do that. Here's a close-up of North Carolina hog farms. Big hog farming area. In that area, here's your top 10 pork-producing countries in the world. China, Cheap, pretty cheap to produce is pork, as long as you get the feed for them. China, big producer. European Union second. The U.S. is third on that list. And here's your top pork producing states. See that on the map there. Mixed crop and livestock areas. Also North Carolina. Throw that into the mix. And then your top 10 states by inventory of pigs. Iowa leads the way. Why? They produce the most food for them. North Carolina second, Minnesota, Illinois, and so forth as you go down the list. And then meat and chicken producing countries in the world. There's a map of that also may be helpful for you to look at. And then I've got number of farms of broilers, chickens. Georgia, Arkansas, Alabama, some of the top states for chicken production. One difference in chickens and pigs and cows is chickens can be raised just about anywhere. They don't need much land. They just need food. Okay, that's the big thing. So a lot of times chickens are raised on cheap land that's not good for much else, is what I'm saying. A lot of chickens were grown in this area for several years, but Arkansas is real famous for chicken production. So is the Carolinas. Here's a dairy farm, a commercial dairy farm today, mass production. Look how close the cows are. Machines are doing the milking. Okay, machines are doing the milking. And then you've got dairy farming areas. Look at this geographical connection. Look at that. Dairy farms are in the same latitude positions. They need cool weather because dairy cattle operate better in cool weather to produce milk. Right? Characteristics of dairy farm. Again, there's more down here. I'm not going to read all this to you. They've become more scattered or more clustered now to certain areas. There's a commercial dairy farm. Your dairy exporters in the world and importers. Yellow means exporters. There's not many of those because of climate recommendations. Other countries need milk. They buy it from the countries that produce it. Something to know, this is important, until recently, your number one milk producing country in the world was always the United States. The U.S. has now been overtaken by what will soon be the most populous country in the world. And we know that they think a lot of cows too, religiously. India is now the number one producing country in the world. And then you take a look at total U.S. milk production. You could look at mixed crop and livestock here too, guys. Whether it's milk production or mixed crop and livestock, production is increasing. Get this. We have less dairy cows than we've ever had in the United States. We have less dairy farmers than ever in the United States, but we're producing more milk. Why? Better methods, knowing what kind of feeds to give them, knowing what kind of breeds to make sure we're using, feeding them the right way. These are the things commercial farms do that allow there to be less farms, less farmers, bigger farms, and more production. And that's what you're seeing. So please don't say dairy farming has died out. It hasn't. It's just become business-like and factory farming-like. Look at the growth of dairy farms in California. California is now your top dairy state, believe it or not, in the U.S., at least for organic milk. Organic means it's natural, no additives. The cows were, they've not been given any extra steroid injections, anything like that. California is number one. Californians are more health conscious in general, so there's no surprise on that. Your top 8 states for milk production in the U.S. today, California is number 1, Wisconsin 2, and then you go on down the list, see Idaho, New York, other places like that, and then all others at 33%. You do need to look over these. You can do that on your own. You can also look over production versus herd size. Guys, this is all valuable. The video has went a little longer than I really intended it to, but this is such valuable information. Please let me know if you have questions. Mixed crop and livestock, map it, know what it is. Dairy farming, I grew up on a farm, and so I've got some interesting stories about some of this, and I may share that in a separate video. But if you have questions about any of this, please let me know. We'll talk about 2 other types of farming tomorrow. Mixed crop and livestock, dairy farming, what's changed about them, where are they found in the United States, where are they found in the world, and how does commercial farming of this type look different than subsistence, which is done for survival?